The contract was simple, brutal, and non-negotiable. 50% of everything Louis Armstrong earned would go to Joe Glaser, not the industry standard 10 or 15%, not even the aggressive 25% some powerful managers commanded. 50%, half of every dollar, every recording royalty, every performance fee, every endorsement deal, for the rest of Louis Armstrong's life. And in 1935, when Louis was 34 years old, broke, legally entangled, and desperate, he signed it. Because Joe Glaser, a white manager with connections to organized crime and a reputation for ruthless efficiency, made a promise. "I'll make you the biggest star in the world. You'll never have to worry about money again, but I own half of you." Louis signed, and for the next 34 years, until Joe Glaser's death in 1969, that contract governed everything. Glaser took half of everything Louis earned, and in return he delivered on his promise. Louis Armstrong became one of the most famous entertainers on the planet, wealthy beyond anything he'd imagined as a child in New Orleans. But the question that would haunt Louis for decades, the question that makes this story more complicated than simple exploitation, was this: did Joe Glaser save Louis Armstrong, or did he own him? And can those two things be separated? In 1935, Louis Armstrong was in crisis. He'd fled to Europe to escape both legal problems in the United States and the increasing control that gangsters had over his career in Chicago. He'd been successful, yes, but that success had made him a target. People wanted money from him, wanted to control him, wanted to use his talent for their own profit. He had no structure, no protection, no one managing his career with any long-term vision. He was making money but losing it just as fast to lawyers, hangers-on, bad investments, and the general chaos that characterized his life. He needed help, needed someone who could navigate the complex world of entertainment business, organized crime, and racial politics that governed a black performer's career in 1930s America. Joe Glaser was everything Louis wasn't. White, connected, ruthless in business dealings, comfortable operating in the gray areas between legal and illegal. He'd run the Sunset Cafe in Chicago, one of the clubs where Louis had performed in the 1920s, and he'd watched Louis's talent and watched the chaos surrounding it. Glaser saw opportunity. Not the kind of opportunity a manager typically sees, a talented artist who needs guidance, but a different calculation entirely. Louis Armstrong was potentially worth millions, but only if someone could control the chaos, protect the asset, and maximize the return. Glaser believed he could do all three, but his price was steep. When Glaser approached Louis in 1935 with his proposal, the terms were shocking even by the standards of an exploitative industry. 50% wasn't a management fee, it was ownership. Glaser wasn't offering to work for Louis. He was offering to become Louis's partner, with equal claim to everything Louis created. The arrangement would give Glaser control over Louis's schedule, his performances, his recordings, his public appearances, essentially his entire professional life. In exchange, Glaser would handle everything: bookings, contracts, legal issues, publicity, financial management, protection from both legitimate and illegitimate threats. Louis would never have to worry about business again. He could focus entirely on his art while Glaser handled everything else. Louis understood what he was being offered. It wasn't rescue. It was a transaction. Glaser would make him rich and famous, but the cost was autonomy. Louis would become, in a very real sense, Glaser's property. Not legally, of course, but functionally, practically, Louis would belong to Joe Glaser. Every decision about his career would flow through Glaser. Every opportunity would be filtered through Glaser's calculations about profit and risk. Louis would perform brilliantly, would create the music, would be the talent, but Glaser would own half of everything that talent produced. The desperation Louis felt in 1935 made the choice feel inevitable. He needed structure, needed protection. Needed someone who could navigate worlds he didn't understand, and Glaser, for all his ruthlessness, was offering something valuable: competence, the promise that someone would actually manage Louis's career professionally instead of the improvised chaos that had characterized his business affairs up to that point. So Louis signed, committed himself to a relationship that would last the rest of his working life. Gave Joe Glaser 50% of everything and trusted that the exchange would be worth it. And Joe Glaser delivered. Almost immediately, Louis's career transformed. Glaser booked him into better venues, negotiated better contracts, expanded Louis's audience beyond jazz clubs into mainstream entertainment. He got Louis onto radio, into films, onto television when that medium emerged. He protected Louis from the worst exploitation by venue. Owners and promoters, though of course Glaser himself was taking an outsized share. He managed Louis' finances with an iron fist, investing Louis' earnings in ways that actually built wealth rather than disappearing into the hands of hangers-on and bad advisors. Within 5 years of signing with Glaser, Louis Armstrong was an international star. Not just famous in jazz circles, but genuinely mainstream, performing for integrated audiences, earning fees that put him among the highest paid entertainers of any race. The money was extraordinary. Louis bought a house, supported family members, lived with a security he'd never known, and every dollar he earned, Joe Glaser took half. The arrangement was working exactly as Glaser had promised. Louis was becoming rich and famous. But he was becoming rich and famous according to Glaser's plan, on Glaser's schedule. Following Glaser's vision, the control was absolute and subtle. Glaser didn't micromanage Louis' artistic choices. Louis could play what he wanted, arrange his music how he preferred, develop his sound according to his own instincts. But everything else, where he performed, when he performed, who he performed with, how much he was paid, what contracts he signed, what opportunities he pursued, all of that went through Glaser. And Glaser's calculus wasn't just about maximizing income, though that was certainly primary. It was also about controlling narrative, managing image, protecting investment. When Louis wanted to speak out about civil rights issues, Glaser often counseled caution. Not because Glaser was racist, though he certainly operated within racist power structures, but because controversy could affect bookings, could reduce Louis' mainstream appeal, could impact the bottom line that Glaser had 50% stake in. When Louis wanted to take time off, wanted to rest, wanted to pursue projects that interested him artistically but might not be commercially successful, Glaser would push back. The machine couldn't stop. The money couldn't stop flowing, because Glaser's 50% depended on Louis' constant productivity. Louis began to feel the weight of the arrangement in ways that money couldn't resolve. He was wealthy, yes, famous, certainly, but he wasn't free. Every decision about his professional life required Glaser's approval. Every opportunity was evaluated not by whether Louis wanted it, but by whether Glaser thought it made financial sense. Louis was the talent, the draw, the irreplaceable element of the equation, but Glaser was the decision maker. And that power dynamic, maintained over decades, created a relationship that was both partnership and possession. The complexity deepened because Louis genuinely liked Joe Glaser, called him Pops, a term of affection Louis reserved for people he truly cared about. Glaser wasn't just a business manager. He was a friend, a protector, someone Louis trusted in ways he didn't trust many people. When racist hotel policies tried to deny Louis rooms, Glaser fought back viciously. When promoters tried to cheat Louis, Glaser used every tool at his disposal, legal and otherwise, to ensure Louis got paid. When Louis' health started failing in his later years, Glaser was one of the people pushing him to rest, to take care of himself, to prioritize longevity over short-term profit. But Glaser's protection came with strings. He protected Louis because Louis was valuable, because Louis was the asset that generated Glaser's income. It was genuine care built on a foundation of financial interest, and Louis understood that, lived with that ambiguity, never quite knew whether Glaser's concern was for Louis the person or Louis the revenue stream. Probably it was both. Probably Glaser couldn't separate the two any more than Louis could. The financial arrangement meant that Louis could never fully escape Glaser's influence. Even when Louis disagreed with Glaser's decisions, even when he resented the control, even when he wanted to make different choices, the contract bound them together. 50% meant Glaser had as much stake in Louis' success as Louis did. They were partners whether Louis always felt like a partner or not, and Glaser, to his credit, treated the partnership seriously. He worked tirelessly Louis' behalf, not out of altruism but out of rational self-interest. Louis' success was Glaser's success. Louis' wealth was Glaser's wealth. The arrangement aligned their interests in ways that made Glaser genuinely invested in Louis' career, even if his methods were controlling. Other musicians looked at Louis' arrangement with Glaser with a mixture of envy and horror. Envy because Glaser got results, made Louis rich and famous, and protected in ways other black performers couldn't achieve. Horror because 50% was obscene, was exploitation, was a white manager taking advantage of a black artist who'd had limited options and desperate circumstances. Both reactions were valid. The arrangement was both beneficial and exploitative. Louis wouldn't have achieved what he achieved without Glaser's management. but Louis also paid far more than he should have had to pay for that management. As decades passed, as Louis became not just famous but iconic, the question of whether he could have renegotiated the contract became more pressing. By the 1950s and 60s, Louis had leverage. He was Louis Armstrong. He could have demanded better terms, could have threatened to leave, could have used his fame to negotiate a more favorable split, but he never did. Whether that was because of loyalty to Glaser, fear of what leaving might cost him, comfort with the familiar arrangement, or genuine belief that the 50% was fair, Louis maintained the contract until Glaser's death. Friends would sometimes ask Louis about it, would suggest that 50% was too much, that he deserved better. Louis's response was always complicated. Glaser made me rich, he'd say. Before him, I was making nothing. And keeping even less. Now I'm making millions and keeping half. Half of millions is better than all of nothing. It was a rationalization, perhaps, but it was also true. The contract that seemed exploitative in isolation had produced results that benefited Louis enormously. Was he being cheated out of the other 50%? Or was he receiving 50% of wealth he never would have generated without Glaser? The relationship between Louis and Joe Glaser reveals uncomfortable truths about power, race, and opportunity in mid-20th century America. Louis, despite his immense talent, despite becoming one of the most famous entertainers in the world, still operated within constraints that white performers didn't face. He needed a white manager to navigate white-controlled business structures. He needed someone with connections to organized crime to protect him from organized crime. He needed someone who could speak the language of power to ensure he got paid, got treated fairly, got the opportunities his talent deserved. Joe Glaser provided all of that, but he did so while taking an enormous cut, while maintaining control that often superseded Louis's own preferences, while building his own wealth on Louis's labor and genius. It was exploitation. And it was also, within the constrained options available to a black performer in that era, a form of protection. Both things were true simultaneously, and Louis lived in that complexity, benefited from Glaser's management while also being limited by it, became wealthy while also being controlled. In 1969, Joe Glaser died. He was 73 years old, and he'd managed Louis Armstrong's career for 34 years. Louis was 68. Still performing, still famous, still earning. The death freed Louis from the contract that had governed his entire adult professional life. After more than 3 decades of giving Joe Glaser 50% of everything, Louis was finally fully in control of his own earnings, his own schedule, his own career. Louis's reaction to Glaser's death was complicated and revealing. He grieved genuinely. Lost someone who had been part of his life for decades, someone he'd trusted, someone he'd called friend despite the complex power dynamics between them. But he also felt something else, relief perhaps, or possibility, the sense that for the first time in 34 years he could make decisions without filtering them through Glaser's calculations about profit and risk. But that freedom came too late. Louis was old, his health failing, his performing days numbered. He had 2 years left to live. The autonomy he'd finally regained arrived when he had minimal capacity to exercise it. He would die in 1971, having spent the vast majority of his career under contract to a manager who took half of everything. And the question remained unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. Would Louis Armstrong have been better off without Joe Glaser? Would he have been as successful, as wealthy, as protected? Or would the chaos that had characterized his pre-Glaser career have prevented him from achieving the heights he eventually reached? The 50% that Joe Glaser took from Louis Armstrong represented more than money. It represented control, protection, opportunity, and limitation all mixed together. It was the price of success in a system that required black performers to rely on white intermediaries to access mainstream audiences and fair compensation. It was exploitation that produced genuine benefit. It was a relationship built on mutual need that nonetheless privileged one party's power over the other's autonomy. Today, the creator economy faces similar dynamics. Artists, musicians, content creators all negotiate with platforms, managers, labels, organizations that promise to amplify their reach in exchange for significant percentages of their earnings. The specific numbers may differ, the context may vary, but the fundamental question remains: when does partnership become possession? When does necessary intermediation become exploitation? At what point does the percentage someone takes cross from fair compensation for genuine value added to extractive capture of someone else's talent? Louis Armstrong and Joe Glaser don't provide easy answers. To these questions, their relationship was too complex, too embedded in specific historical circumstances, too successful by some metrics and too exploitative by others. What their story does provide is a case study in the economics and power dynamics of talent representation. A reminder that contracts signed in desperation can govern entire careers. That success achieved through someone else's management always comes with the question of who really owns that success. The manager who took half of everything, Joe Glaser, he made Louis Armstrong wealthy and famous and controlled, protected and limited, successful and dependent, and Louis accepted it, lived with it, benefited from it, was constrained by it for 34 years, until Glaser died and Louis was finally free. 2 years before Louis himself died, too late to change anything, too late to know what he might have achieved without giving away half of everything, too late for anything except wondering whether the bargain had been worth it, and finding, probably, that the answer was both yes and no, that 50% was both too much and exactly what it cost to become Louis Armstrong.